Once I said goodbye to New York City.
May 1st, 1941, outside the Palace Theater in New York City on West 47th Street and Broadway. There's a throng of onlookers comprising every social strata of New York society. They've come to see one man. That man, as usual, is late. He's known to work himself to the bone and party even harder. He's had romances with some of the most famous and attractive women in the country, including Virginia Nicholson, Dolores Del Rio, and Rita Hayworth. He's been hailed as a genius, a charlatan, an incredible friend, an asshole, a hard driver, a steady worker, and a man who drank too much. For the past 3 years, he's been firmly planted on the tip of every American's tongue. He's Orson Welles, and we're at the premiere of his first feature film. It's a film that he's written, produced, directed, and starred in. It's a contract never before seen, and arguably never again given. It's a film that got him in hot water with both the major motion picture studios and publishing houses across the country. It's a film that would go on to be a critical success and a commercial flop. The film is Citizen Kane. All those who voiced opinions on both the man and this film would agree on one thing: that Orson Welles knew how to make an entrance. Finally, here he comes. In a country uneasily impressed, he's managed to make an indelible mark in the theater, on the radio, and now on the silver screen. Orson Welles at the time was still hailed as the Boy Wonder. On May 1st, 1941, he was just 25 years old. How did he get to this point? Tonight, we'll find out.
If I come by plane, I can see those buildings high. And if I come by boat, I can really heave a sigh. And if I come by
Welcome to Breaking Walls, episode number 79. My name is James Scully. Tonight on Breaking Walls, we'll examine Orson Welles' career, mainly between the years 1937 and 1941. We'll focus more on radio than anything else, but we'll also look back at his years prior to 1937 and touch on his stage and screen work as well. If this is your first time listening to Breaking Walls, thank you. Welcome to the show. You can find this show on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, and just about everywhere else you might get your podcast. You can also go to thewallbreakers.com for show notes, articles, and the ability to download each episode as an MP3. Tonight's opening theme is New York City Blues by Peggy Lee. It's a song that holds true to all those who've been to New York, and it's a song that's close to this Brooklyn boy's heart. If you've been enjoying Breaking Walls, especially on iTunes, do me a favor. Just scroll down and give me a quick rating and review. It'll really help people discover the show, and hey, if you like my voice, I'd appreciate that very much. And just a reminder that coming May 15th, A Man Named Marlowe will premiere in the same feed that you get this show. It'll be a 6-part, 30-minute audio drama miniseries, with the central character being Raymond Chandler's famous private detective, Philip Marlowe. It'll predate The Big Sleep, and we'll get into how and why Marlowe became the Marlowe we've known him to become. You can also support this show and unlock juicy bonus content and other extras at patreon.com/thewallbreakers. And to keep easily abreast with the show, you can join our Wallbreakers Facebook group or follow the show on Twitter and on Instagram.
New York!
My father lived in Peking part of every year for quite a while, and I used to go and stay with him. I used to speak a little Mandarin, and China was as part of my home memories as much as the Middle West. It's kind of the forbidden city in Grand Detour, Illinois.
He was born George Orson Welles on May 6, 1915 in Kenosha, Wisconsin, the son of Richard and Beatrice Ives Welles. His father was an eccentric, an inventor of a bicycle lamp that made the family a fortune and an alcoholic who later stopped working altogether. He had one brother, Richard III, who had to be institutionalized because of learning difficulties. Richard and Beatrice's marriage was a difficult one. Orson's parents separated when he was 4. His mother was a pianist who, when the family moved to Illinois in 1919, played at the Art Institute of Chicago to help support her son. She taught him. He enjoyed playing music. But just 4 days after Wells's 9th birthday, on May 10th, 1924, Beatrice died of hepatitis. After his mother's death, Wells moved around frequently. First to Wyoming, New York, where he spent his summers at a private art colony established by Lydia Avery Coonley Ward. Later, his father took him along on his world travels, eventually settling in a hotel in Grand Detour, Illinois. Wells spoke about his father during an interview with Dick Cavett in the early 1970s.
My father bought a country hotel in a town with a population of 150 people called Grand Detour, Illinois. And he had this hotel because he had the kind of inverted snobism that made it impossible for him to have a country house. So he had a country hotel, and he didn't allow any paying guests. They had to be just his friends. And anybody came hoping for a room, there was no highway past it or anything. They didn't have a chance of a bed. There was always said, we're full up. They could see it was empty, you know. And he had great cooks and had his own bakehouse, his own smokehouse, and lived this great kind of 1880 life, you know, and there was no car in town. We rode with a horse and buggy. It was like being raised 70 years ago instead of my real children. It was a wonderful experience. And he spent 2 months every year at Grand Detour running this hotel. And the servants were all old show business people. My father was mad about old but cheap show business people. There was a fellow called Rattlesnake Oil Emery, who had been a medicine showman. And there was a lady who could do the call of birds by whistling. It was all made up of these kind of people who just lived there and ran this hotel and refused anybody a room in it until my father would come and stay. And it burnt down with him in it. He escaped, coming out of the flames while all his jade collection from China burned up and everything else. He's a very old man because he's quite old when I was born. He emerged from the flames in a dressing gown, a real nightshirt, you know, the comic nightshirt, with a parrot in a cage and a signed photograph of Trixie Ferganza under his arm.
Who is Trixie Ferganza?
Trixie Ferganza was from the era of flesh-colored tights.
And those were his treasures?
Well, that was what he brought out of the fire. He was an extraordinary sort of man.
In 1926, at the age of 11, he entered the Todd Seminary School for Boys, an expensive independent school in Woodstock, Illinois. It proved to be an invaluable experience. It was there that Wells developed social skills, furthered his education and sense of culture, and got his first exposure to the theater and radio. While a student at the Todd Seminary, Wells wrote and starred in an adaptation of Sherlock Holmes. It was his first major radio credit. When his father died in December of 1930, he left Wells in charge of his own future. When he graduated from Todd in 1931, rather than attend Harvard, he chose to travel.
I've always heard, I have this image of you in Ireland, coming over a hill with a horse and a cart, as it's been
Donkey
reported.
and cart.
A donkey? It's
a
true.
Donkey and cart.
Were you a forerunner of the hippie movement in some sense?
Well, I wish I could pretend to have been that. I think I was just a latter-day romantic, you know, rather than a forerunner of the hippie movement, because really it's a kind of ridiculous romantic thing to do, to go and buy a donkey and cart and travel around Ireland, sleep under the cart. I was trying to be a painter, you know. I only wanted to be a painter.
You were in your teens then, weren't you?
Yes, I was 15. And I had got a scholarship to Harvard, which I didn't want. And in order to stay out of university, which struck me as the most terrible fate that could possibly happen to anybody, I really ran away with a few $100s that was found in the box after my father died, and went to Ireland. I bought a donkey and cart in Galway and started out. And at night I slept under the cart. I had the paints in the cart. I painted every day that it wasn't raining, which means I didn't do much painting. And I ended up with no paintings at all, because the Irish, in those days anyway, particularly in the West, would take no money for food or anything from somebody like that traveling around. But they wanted a painting. So these thatched cottages of Connemara are absolutely full of terrible Wells paintings. Then I came to Dublin. I was broke, had no money at all, and the only thing to do was go back and go to Harvard. So I went to the Gate Theatre, which was the great theatre of Dublin, and I told them I was a famous star from New York, and that it would amuse me for a few weeks to play some leading parts in their theatre. No. I'd never been on the stage. I had no idea what it was like to be on the stage. And I never would have been able to tell such a lie if I'd had any ambition to be on the stage or any idea. It was just the kind of lie you can tell, because what can they do to you? You know, you go on the stage, where they got to kill you. All they do is fire you. It's a way to eat. So they gave me a star part. I began as a star. And I've been working my way down slowly ever since.
I don't know why more people don't think of that. It's much easier.
Wells was 16 at the time. Shortly before his 18th birthday in the spring of 1933, Orson Welles booked second-class passage on a tramp steamer, the Experiment, bound for Morocco. While on board, he worked on an introduction for a book he was writing called Everybody's Shakespeare. It was to be published by his Todd Seminary School mentor Roger Hill for their school's press. Everybody's Shakespeare was meant to be an educational device to help children understand the bard. Wells also illustrated many of the passages. He struggled with his own feelings in writing the book. He was deeply worried that he had no right to assume Shakespeare meant one verse to be angry, another to cause someone to smile. He expressed these fears in a letter to Roger Hill, telling his mentor he wished that he was here to see the many characters on the steamer, and included a bit of poetry about his life on the high seas. Days now numberless, it seems to me. We've lulled and wallowed in a lusty sea. Time is a thing that used to be. The order and ascent of days is nothing now. A March-blown ocean mauls our plunging prow. An acreage, hysterical for us to plow. Crash in the galley. Crashes are constant now. Shiver the empty Experiment from screw to prow. Time is a thing that used to be. The order and ascent of days is nothing now. Everybody's Shakespeare would remain in print for decades. In 1933, Roger and Hortense Hill invited Wells to a party in Chicago, where Wells met famous playwright and author Thornton Wilder. Wilder arranged for him to meet writer and literary critic Alexander Woollcott in New York. It was a meeting that forever changed the course of Wells's life.
Alec Woollcott got so angry with me once at a party. He introduced me because he was the one who kind of started me again in show business, and he presented me as somebody at a party that should be interesting. And there I was, 19 years old. There wasn't anything interesting to say about me. I hadn't done anything in America. And he says, well, Orson was born in Peking. And I said no. And a look of hatred came over Alex's face when I had told him it was Kenosha, Wisconsin, instead of Peking, because it was the only interesting thing he could think of to say about me.
In 1933, actress, writer, producer, and theater owner Catherine Cornell was assembling a stock theater company called the Cornell-McClintock Corporation with her husband, director Guthrie McClintock. She was a friend of Alexander Woollcott's, who had once dubbed her the First Lady of the theater. Woollcott was aware of a recent pre-code film adaptation of Shakespeare's Twelfth Night that Wells shot at the Todd Seminary School. At a social gathering of New York's cultural elite, Woollcott introduced Wells and Cornell to each other. Guthrie McClintock immediately put Wells under contract and cast him in 3 plays: Romeo and Juliet, Candida, and the company's first production, an adaptation of Rudolph Bezier's The Barretts of Wimpole Street. The play was based on the romance between English poets Robert Browning and Elizabeth Barrett, and her father's unwillingness to allow them to marry. This play gave Catherine Cornell her signature role. A couple of years later, it gave Orson Welles a signature on-the-air flub.
I had a show. I was the voice of cornstarch.
Oh, you're putting me on now.
I kid you not, and it was one of my first really good jobs because it was 5 days a week, $75 a time. All I had to come in was read a poem while the singing strings of somebody or other played, and I'd read this thing. And I had to write a little thing about the poem before I would read it. It was a 15-minute spot for the housewife at noon. And I had been up about 3 nights without being to sleep for overwork, as you may imagine. Came in one day, and it was a poem they picked for me by Robert Browning, and I couldn't understand what it was about. And I didn't know what to say about it. And I remembered a line from a play that I'd been in, The Barretts of Wimpole Street with Cornell, when she says to Browning, who was a character in the play, "What does this poem mean?" And he says, kind of a funny line that he really said in life, "When this was written, only God and Robert Browning know what it meant. Now only God does." So I thought, I'll say this, the ladies will enjoy it. So on singing strings. And all the sponsors, and the smaller a show was, the more sponsors would be in a
of course,
in a room, you know, were gathered. And I said, "Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. This poem puts me in mind of what the author said originally, that when this was written, only Brob and Grobbit breeding." When Grot was written, only Grobbit breeding. Music continued. When Grob and Bribbit... When God was written, only Brob and Brit and Dritting. And then I saw all of these faces, purple and black, staring at me. And I just put down the script, walked out of the studio, and never saw them again.
Never saw.
Wells would tour with the stock company for 36 weeks, beginning November of 1933. In that time, he'd be part of over 200 live productions. Shortly thereafter, in 1934, he got his first job in New York on perhaps the most outstanding show in educational radio, the Columbia Broadcasting System's American School of the Air. It was broadcast each weekday afternoon at 2:30 Eastern Standard Time. The show was offered as a teaching supplement, the equivalent to a half-hour course. Though Wells was working anonymously, the increased cachet helped him stage a summer drama festival with the Todd School in Woodstock, Illinois, which featured stage luminaries from both Dublin and New York. It was there that Wells produced an 8-minute short entitled The Hearts of Age, his version of a surrealist film. That autumn and winter, Wells was married to Chicago socialite and actress Virginia Nicholson, and he appeared as Tybalt in a revised production of Cornell's Romeo and Juliet at the Martin Beck Theater on 45th Street near Times Square. His performance brought him to the attention of producer John Houseman, who cast Wells in his production of Archibald MacLeish's Panic. MacLeish saw Wells's performance and recommended him to audition for CBS's March of Time radio stock company. Wells debuted on the news documentary show in March of 1935. By the spring, he was appearing regularly.
Today is published the most comprehensive treatise on Americanisms to date, the book whose previous editions were read in England, translated into German. H.L. Mencken's 769-page The American Language. On the future of the American language, says Mr. Mencken.
The influence of 125 million people, practically all headed in one direction, is too great to be resisted by the minority in England. Wherever the King's English comes into competition with the President's American, American tends to prevail. The international language of the future may look like English, but it will sound like American.
For the remainder of 1935 and into 1936, Wells worked exclusively on radio for CBS, appearing in productions of The March of Time, America's Hour, Musical Reveries, and on July 18, 1936, the debut episode of an experimental dramatic anthology program that would help shape radio for years to come, known as the Columbia Workshop.
The Columbia Workshop, under the direction of Irving Reese. Ladies and gentlemen, Columbia takes pride in inaugurating tonight a new series of programs dedicated to you and to the magic of radio, the Columbia Workshop. The Columbia Workshop believes in radio, in its past accomplishments, and in its promise for the future. Radio has reduced the area of the world to a split second of time for the transmission of human thought and feeling through man's literature, his music, his spoken word. In the 5 centuries that bridge the years since Gutenberg invented movable type and gave the world the store of man's knowledge through the printed word, no discovery has promised greater potentialities for shaping the world's culture than the slim, swift...
The program's creator and director, Irving Reese, immediately recognized Wells's talent. Wells began to take note of the ways in which Reese was willing to take risks in order to push the medium of radio forward. Simultaneously, it was through the March of Time and the Columbia Workshop that Wells began to assemble what would come to be known as the Mercury Theater. It just so happened that as part of President Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal Emergency Relief Appropriation Act of 1935, a Works Progress Administration was established. A program was put together to fund live artistic performances and entertainment avenues in the United States. One of the original ventures was the Federal Theater Project. That year in 1935, John Houseman was directing an African-American theater unit in Harlem. He invited the 20-year-old Wells to be part of the project. Their first co-production was an adaptation of Shakespeare's Macbeth with an entirely African-American cast. Wells changed the setting to a mythical island with Haitian voodoo, fulfilling the role of Scottish witchcraft. The play opened on April 14, 1936 at the Lafayette Theater in Harlem and received incredible reviews.
Accursed be the tongue that tells me so. And be these juggling fiends no more believed. Hail, King! Behold, where stands the usurper's cursed head. The time is free! All hail Malcolm! Peace! The charms wound up!
By that autumn, Wells was jet-setting back and forth from Chicago to New York to appear for the Mutual Broadcasting System's Wonder Show, broadcast live from the Chicago Civic Opera House. He was making inroads into other major American cities and appearing on multiple networks.
The great period of radio was from the time when I very fortuitously, and didn't know this at the time, obviously happened to fall into New York, from that to the war. From 1937, 38 really, through the war. It was only 7 years. Mm-hmm. The golden age of radio. At this time, we were trying to find out how to do it. Mm-hmm. We were learning skills. We were sharpening and honing our abilities. If you saw, good heavens, predating the War of the Worlds by a year, when Irving Reese did The Fall of the City in 37, spring of 37, The Fall of the City by Archibald MacLeish, a verse play with one of America's outstanding poets, a man who was so impressed by the medium of radio that he submitted to Irving Reese in the Columbia Workshop a verse play for radio. And who directed that? Irving Reese, with all of the directorial staff of CBS assisting him.
Yeah, that was a mammoth
Earl
production.
McGill,
Yes.
Brewster Morgan, myself, Bill Spear, all assisting. Orson Welles as narrator, Burgess Meredith as chief orator. Names that we conjure with now were just kids then.
Yeah, Orson Welles was probably about 22, 23 at the time.
22 and 37. He was 23 at the time of the other show.
And didn't you use a big mammoth studio, or you rented a National Guard hall or something to get special
the 7th
effects?
Regiment Armory on Park Avenue. Yeah.
So that was remote. It was done live, the whole show.
Yeah, it was done live, but it was remote from the Armory.
And that was to get the effect of the crowd or something?
What Irving wanted to get was an outdoor perspective, dead air, outdoor, no reverb. He put his cast in this vast armory. Now, my responsibility was crowd direction. We had a crowd of 150 people. The crowd was a character in the play as the Greeks wrote for the chorus. Mm-hmm. They had no words, but they had reactions. And I was the cheerleader for the crowd. But to limit that, to control a small orchestra, but with very piercing, primitive instruments. I mean, by that, woodwinds and tambours and so on. To control that, to control the narrator, Wells worked in an isolation booth, which were quite new in those days. All of this to give an impression of great space without reverberation. Because Irving was a genius at this kind of conception. Unheard of in those days, unheard of today. What television producer gives a damn about sound? They pump all this $250,000 production through a 4-inch speaker.
On Sunday, April 11th, 1937 at 7 p.m. on CBS, as producer-director William N. Robeson just noted, the Columbia Workshop broadcast a verse play written especially for radio by Archibald MacLeish entitled The Fall of the City. It was an allegory on the rise of fascism, the first ever like it written for radio. Remember, this was April of 1937. The Nazi hate machine was on the rise. The inevitability of war had begun to spread throughout the world like a dark and chilling energy. The broadcast took place at the massive 7th Regiment Armory on 67th Street and Park Avenue in New York. It wasn't only the crowd of 150 extras at the Armory that functioned as the frightened chorus. The space created a sonic atmosphere that bellowed out of the listening public's radio receivers and made the listening spaces they were in feel as though they were part of the action. As the play begins, a thoroughly frightened populace awaits for the arrival of a conqueror. The crowd buzzes about with nervous excitement and anticipation. It sounded unlike anything that had been broadcast before. Both MacLeish and program director Irving Reese entrusted one man to lead the narration. That man was the 22-year-old Orson Welles.
They're very high. The tomb is off to the right somewhere. We can't see for the great crowd. Close to us here are the cabinet ministers. They stand on a raised platform with awnings. The farmers' wives are squatting on the stones. Their children have fallen asleep on their shoulders. The heat is harsh. The light dazzles like metal. It dazes the air as the clang of a gong does. It is 1 minute to 12 now. There is still no sign. They are still waiting. No one doubts that she will come. No one doubts that she will speak, too. 3 times she has not spoken. Now it is 12. Now they are rising. Now the whole plaza is rising. Fathers are lifting their small children. The plumed fans on the platform are motionless. There's no sound but the shuffle of shoe leather. Now even the shoes are still. We can hear the hawks. It is as quiet as that now. It is strange to see such throngs so silent. Nothing yet. Nothing has happened. Wait. There's a stir here to the right of us. They're turning their heads. The crowd turns. The cabinet ministers lean from their balcony. There's no sound, only the turning.
First the waters rose with no wind.
Listen. That is she. She's speaking.
Then the stones of the temple kindled without flame or tinder of maize leaves.
They see her beyond us. The crowd sees her.
Then there were cries in the night haze, words in a once-heard tongue, the air rustling above us as at dawn with herons. Now it is I who must bring fear, I who am 4 days dead, the tears still unshed for me, all of them. I for whom a child still calls at nightfall. Death is young in me to fear. My dress is kept still in the press in my bedchamber. No one has broken the dish of the dead woman. Nevertheless, I must speak painfully. I am to stand here in the sun and speak. The city of masterless men will take a master. There will be shouting men, blood after. Do not ask what it means. I do not know. Only sorrow and no hope for it.
She is gone. No, they are still looking.
It is hard to return from the time past. I have come in the dream we must learn to dream, where the crumbling of time like the ash from a burnt string has stopped for me. For you the thread still burns. You take the feathery ash upon your fingers. You bring yourselves from the time past as it pleases you. It is hard to return to the old nearness, harder to go again.
She is gone. We know because the crowd is closing. All we can see is the crowd closing. We hear the releasing of held breath. the weight shifting, the lifting of shoe leather. The stillness is broken as surface of water is broken, the sound circling from in outward. Small wonder they feel fear. Before the murders of the famous kings, before imperial cities burned and fell, the dead were said to show themselves and speak. When dead men came, disaster came. Presentiments that let the living on their beds sleep on woke dead men out of death and gave them voices.
Masterless men, when shall it be? Masterless men will take
As head of CBS William S. Paley noted, the play was a sensation, which helped point the way to what radio could achieve. It was selected by the New York Times as one of the outstanding broadcasts of 1937. Time magazine noted that it proved to most listeners that the radio, which conveys only sound, is science's gift to poetry and poetic drama. Thanks to the character of his voice and the power of his tone, The Fall of the City made Orson Welles an overnight star and gave him the opportunity of a lifetime. Radio would never again be the same.